Oh, okay. So we've got it. Good. Okay. Good morning to any of you who are coming on live. Let's get that over there. There we go. Good morning, Cody. I hope you are healthy. Asada, good morning. Let's see, we've got a little of that. Hi, Amanda. Good morning, Haley. Good morning, Teresa. Hi, Alexis. Did you guys get some nice rain last night? Around midnight or 3 o'clock in the morning? Encourage you to sleep a little bit. Thank you. Yes, that is her wedding picture. Yeah, thank you. Sweet lady. Good morning, Jerkita. Jerkita. This is Thursday, so what was the last thing we covered in chapter 12? I think we were into chapter 12. It seems like we finished the eye, made sure we were through with the eye. Is that right? Did we finish the eye? So what was the last thing we covered, Chiquita? That's good. I'm glad we're that far along. Good morning, Rhonda. Hey, Brandy. Maybe the others are having a little challenge with the. Thank you, Jaquita. Maybe they're having a challenge with getting onto the system. Sometimes that's one of the problems at Lawrence Darlington Tech. You knew when it started raining, somehow things are going to get out of whack. I don't know where the break in the line is, but that seems to be the case sometimes. Okay, so we were probably on about page 428 in the textbook. It had mentioned the longitudinal fissure, deep groove, as opposed to the shallow sulci that you see on the other parts of the cerebrum. Shallow ditches, so to speak. We'll give them a few more minutes because it just might be the weather. We haven't got it perfected yet. Thank you, Draquita. Good morning, Monica. Well, let's look on page 428 and 429. I think that's where we finished. That should be one of my New Year's resolution is to sort of keep up where 5 different sections are. So we're all together. I keep forgetting to do that. Thank you for reminding me where we cut off last time. So as we look on page 428, I think as Jerkita said, we talked about the long, deep groove on the cerebrum. So you have a right and a left cerebral hemisphere. Everybody see that on page 428? Figure 12.4. The lobes of the cerebrum. So we mentioned the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Thank you, Rhonda. Now, did we get into on page 429 in the first column where you see it says the lobes of the cerebrum, and we talked about all of those lobes and the functions, sort of the basic functions of those lobes? So did we cover that? So we go all the way down to the insula. Okay, good. All right, so I don't know if we mentioned this or not, but as you look in the second column on page 429, you have the title up at the top in big black letters, bold letters. It says gray matter, cerebral cortex. Okay, so you can see it says functionally the most complex part of the brain is the region of gray matter known as the cerebral cortex. When you think of cortex, if you're a plant person, you think of the cortex, the outside of a tree, the bark, and so forth. And so they use that term also on the brain, and we'll look at that in just a second. I don't think we've looked at that yet, but that's where you do a lot of your thinking, is up there in the cortex. So sometimes when you hear someone say to another person, oh, you're not using your gray matter, or you're not using your cortical layer of your brain, what are you thinking with? Well, what they mean is that you're not really thinking things through. So if you have someone say, you must not have a whole lot of gray matter up there, that gray matter is where actual thinking goes on. And it's only, just like that, so thin. Now let's look over on page 430. And now we have the cerebrum, and that's what's showing. We're not looking at the other parts of the brain, but I do want you to know some parts of those various lobes, the frontal lobe, the occipital, and so forth, in terms of their function. So as you look on page 430, I want you to look in the second column. And you see up at the top there, it says the first sentence, it says the first is the primary somatosensory cortex. And that's where you pick up sensations with your body, so that the wind's blowing on your body. Hello, Jalen. Let's see. Actually, on this side. Jalen, I hope your jawbone is in good shape. Hope it's been healing well. So there's where you pick up, you can see it up at the top. It says primary somatosensory cortex, and it picks up sensations in the environment, whether it's vibrations or heat or wind or whatever. And then you come down, you're in this, over to the right, in this colored brain, and the very right side of it says primary visual cortex. That's where you interpret what you see. All the way in the back of our head, our eyes pick it up, but it transfers back here through various tracts. Remember, tracts are axons that are myelinated. I've got a friend who was in the military with me who got a fungal infection on his primary visual cortex. His eyes were in good shape, but he had a hard time interpreting what he was looking at. Sad situation, and we don't have any way to repair that. So he was compromised in terms of his vision because of that fungus that got back there. Don't see it very often. Sometimes people die from it, but when it gets in there, it can create some problems. So you know about the somatosensory, where you pick up sensations in the environment. The visual cortex. This is figure 12.5 on 430. And you come to an area called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is concerned with understanding language. In other words, being able to put together the sounds that we make and recognizing they mean a particular definition, what they look like, what it maybe smells like, all these things that we can perceive in our mind whenever we're talking a language. And we all use sounds that are peculiar to our society, as opposed to somebody who's from Borneo, and they have a different language out in the jungle, but they talk about the same things that you and I talk about. They talk about the trees and the roots and growing plants and so forth. And I've got a cut in my foot, and they have different sounds for those situations. And so they understand what those words that don't mean anything to us, they understand what those words mean. And so that's where Wernicke's area comes in, understanding a language. And then you move right to the left of Wernicke's area. You have the auditory, primary auditory cortex, and the auditory association cortex. Now, the primary is the one that picks up the sound or interprets the sound to some degree. So we're not going to get, I don't know if we're going to have time to get in the ears, but we've got nerves that run from the ear to that area. And so it picks up the electrochemical signal, which is the action potential. That's amazing. It's the same kind of action potential we talked about with a neuron, or with the action potential going down the sarcolemma of a muscle cell. Same chemical aspect, but this area picks it up as sound. I don't understand that. It's beyond my mind. But good morning, Ramsey. Anyway, we pick it up, and then a lot of times we hear a number of sounds during the day. And when you see the auditory association area, that's where we discern what kind of sound it is. Is it a dog barking? Is it a backfire of an automobile sometime? Is it a firecracker going off? Is it thunder? We've got all these little associations. So those two areas are concerned with picking up the sound and then understanding what the sound is. That's how we learn, and we start programming ourselves as little kids, and we don't think of it as that, but we recognize the sound. So that's two areas there, and then I want you to move to the left a little bit more, and you see Broca's area in figure 12.5, Broca's area, and that's a speech area. So obviously I'm exercising my speech area while you guys are exercising your auditory cortex and your auditory association. I remember one time being in a music store, and I was talking to the guy who owned it and purchasing some sort of a musical material. And this lady was over there looking at the strings of, I think it was some guitar or cello or something like that. And she stood up and she says, "I know that voice." And it was one of my students. And she turned around and there she was. And she had her kids in there doing something. So we learned to recognize each other's voices. That's all part of that auditory association area. But then she was speaking. So her Broca's area was working just like mine is today. And your auditory association and the auditory cortex are picking up on that and storing that information. Now, one other thing I want you to know is you look up at the red and the blue on this illustration, and you see the red says primary motor cortex. And of course, the one we just covered a little bit ago, primary somatosensory. So that picks up the environmental signals, and then our response physically coming in out of the rain or ducking whenever the lightning occurs and thunder is so loud. The motor cortex, remember when we talk about motor, we're talking about nerves that go to muscles, to effectors, like glands and muscles, basically. And so you can see where part of the brain deals with moving the body. Out there where it says prefrontal cortex, that's where people have, we say they have their personality. How do you define that in terms of a physical, chemical or something? Well, we don't have all the answers. All we can do is say is that when that prefrontal cortex to the left, very much to the left, somehow our personality comes out. But you know, personality is a blend, isn't it? It's how you were raised. You and I tend to be like our parents or grandparents, and our personality gets built. We don't have answers. We just don't have answers for that. But when that section gets damaged, it can change the way they respond to people. And we say, boy, their personalities really changed. Pretty soon, for so long they were outgoing, now they're reclusive or something like that, or want to be alone all the time. All we can do is sort of make some educated guesses, some observations. That's part of science. We don't have it together. Don't ever think science has got all the answers to our problems. Let's look over on page 432 now. We've covered the parts of the cerebrum. We've covered sections of each part that deal with various sensory interpretations or maybe motor responses. But you look over on page 432, and you come down in the first column to where you see cerebral white matter. Cerebral white matter. Now, white matter, remember, that means it's myelinated. Now, look at the picture down at the bottom, figure 12.7. And you're looking at a frontal section of the brain. And as you look at the cortex, you see the dark brown, darker, it's not really dark brown, but sort of golden colored, that's your cortex. And then the other things on the inside there, even though they've colored them green and purple and red, those are myelinated fibers, myelinated axons. Now, I want you to notice as you look at the top of that frontal section of a brain, you see commissural fibers of the corpus callosum. Those are white matter. Those are axons that have myelin around them. And notice they connect the left and the right hemispheres. You can see that fissure right down the middle. Looks like a little space, a little ditch, a little crevice. And so those purple structures connect the right cortex with the left cortex. So when you hear some people say, oh, you're only using half your brain. Well, not really. They obviously are using it, but maybe they just don't understand what's going on. But anyway, that's where we have connections so that we respond as a whole. So the commissural fibers connect the two hemispheres. You can see that in the paragraph up above, commissural fibers. Then you see projection fibers. And those are the ones that are green. Some of them are red. But you just look at the green ones first of all. Well, let's look at the, let's do the, yeah, it's the green one, I think. Let me look at it clearly. Yeah, projection fibers. I believe that's right. So you see those green ones, they connect the cortex parts, the cortical parts, on the same hemisphere. So you see the little loops that go from one section of cortex to another section. And so there's a lot of wiring, if we can use that kind of term. There's a lot of wiring that joins the brain so that it responds as a unit. Got to have communication between the different parts. We're not going to get into all of that, but the point is you've got all these connections up here so that the brain functions as one. Some of you may have a house where you have one switch you can turn on and 2 or 3 rooms will be turned on so it looks like somebody's there, or you've got light when you come into a dark house or whatever. So you can think about how we control the light in a room from several different places. Okay, so much for how we got these various fibers like commissural and projection fibers, and they talk about association fibers, different kinds of fibers that hook different parts of the brain together. So we have a unit. Now we're going to leave the cerebrum, and I want you to go over to 433 and look at the bottom, and you'll see the title called the Diencephalon. Now, go back to page 426 for just a minute. As you go back to 426, look over on the right-hand side of the figure at the top, and you see the second thing we're going to cover is the diencephalon. So you look at that line that goes to sort of that purple, kind of looks like Play-Doh that some kids just fashioned in their particular form. That doesn't work. Don't worry about that, Rhonda. That's okay. Just know that we've got fibers that connect various parts of the body. Okay? That's all right. So you see it's called the diencephalon. So we come over to page 434 now. We're back on 434. You look up at the top of that first column. And you see the diencephalons found at the physical center of the brain. And that's going to make a lot of sense in just a couple of minutes. Now, as you look at the first paragraph, it mentions 4 parts, but we're not going to look at 4 parts. We just don't have time to do all that. But you see the italicized words in there. You see the thalamus, and you see hypothalamus. Now, you got a subthalamus and you got an epithalamus. Don't worry about that. We just want to look at the thalamus and sort of encapsulate the basic functions that it carries out. So look at where you see the heading, the thalamus, bold print, and you look at that sentence and it says it consists of 2 large egg-shaped masses of gray matter that make up about 80% of the diencephalon. Now, notice it says between these 2 masses lies a cavity known as the third ventricle. Now, we haven't really even talked about the first and the second, right? If you got a third, then you know you got a first and a second. Those are cavities within the brain, and we'll look at those a little bit later. But they're called ventricles. Now, come on down from third ventricle. Go right down past groups, and you see it says thalamic nuclei. Don't worry about the nuclei, just call it the thalamus. Remember, nuclei got 2 meanings, doesn't it? But here it means a group of cell bodies. Remember that? Okay. As opposed to ganglia, all right, which are outside the central nervous system, but the nuclei, that's a collection of cell bodies within the CNS. So as you look at that, it says the thalamic nuclei receive input from multiple sources, including the cortex, the cerebellum, the basal nuclei, structure. Don't worry about all those components. But your thalamus, let's see if we come down from thalamic nuclei, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you see it says the thalamus is literally the main entrance into the cerebral cortex. Then it has a little line there, and it says nearly all information destined for the cerebral cortex must pass through the thalamus. So it's like the thalamus is a relay station. So as information comes in, whether it's from the ear, whether it's from your eyes, whether it's from the body, the fingers, and so forth, it goes through the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it to the right place. Sometimes people have tried to create an image in your mind about the thalamus as looking like a train yard, where you've got all these tracks in there, and you can change the track direction and send a train in a particular direction. And so it's somewhat like that. Now, that's all we're going to say about the thalamus. It's a lot more complex than what we're doing, but you guys at this point are not going to become neurosurgeons. Come on down to the bottom of the column, and you see hypothalamus. And again, that's a collection of nuclei that are under the thalamus. As a matter of fact, let's do this. Before we mention some of the things the thalamus does, let's look to the right. You see the paragraph where it says hypothalamus. Look to your right, and you see this strange looking structure, but they've got it labeled. And you see thalamus, the kind of the blue structure, blue-gray. And you move to your left and down a little bit, and you see the purple structure is called the hypothalamus, underneath the thalamus. Now, as you look at the paragraph where it says hypothalamus, I want you to come down 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. First column, come down the bottom where you see that title, hypothalamus. Come down 4 lines and go into that paragraph. It says, don't let its small size fool you. And then look at the next, and keep reading. It says that there are a number of functions that keep us alive. The hypothalamus controls a lot of homeostatic mechanisms. We've only touched on a few, haven't we? Keeping the body temperature at a right range, keeping the blood pressure at a right range, keeping the sugar in the bloodstream, keeping the calcium level in the bloodstream, and so forth. So, but that's just a smidgen. You know what a smidgen is? Teeny little bit, okay? Come over to 435. Page 435, look at that first column. Look at the second paragraph. In addition to these roles about body temperature, hunger, and thirst, the hypothalamus has a close anatomical and functional connection to an endocrine system called endocrine organ called the pituitary gland. And you see down a couple of lines, you see the word infundibulum. That's what connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. And if you read on, it says the hypothalamus secretes a variety of hormones that affect the pituitary gland. Now, we're not going to get into that. That's in the endocrine system that you'll take whenever you take 211, maybe this summer, if that's what you have signed up for. Now, there are 2 hormones that the hypothalamus produces. So where you see the word infundibulum, I want you to come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines. And you see it says the hypothalamus also produces 2 additional hormones that do not act on the pituitary. They have their target gland in another place, antidiuretic hormone, which influences water balance, and oxytocin, which plays a role in childbirth. You know, sometimes as I teach this, I just have to stop and I'm in wonder, I'm in awe of how all these different cells come from one cell, and then they are in the right place, secreting the right substance, so that we have an orderly internal environment. I mean, this is beautiful stuff. I know it's a challenge to you at this point. It was to me when I was your age. But the more I look at it, the more I just go, wow, wow. Now, we're going to leave the hypothalamus. So you know basic functions there. Look in the second column and you have the cerebellum. Now you remember the cerebellum is under the occipital lobe. Look on page 437, please. .437. And we've got a sagittal section of the brain. Now go to your right on 437, and of course they label it. If you'll look at the bottom of the cerebrum to the right, you see it says occipital lobe. And then you look below that, you see Cerebral Aqueduct, fourth ventricle, cerebellum. So that little structure, and you're only looking at half of it. Okay, you're not looking at the whole thing. Now, I think you've probably seen some of this in anatomy lab, but that's the cerebellum. And you notice it's sort of dark on the outside, at least darker. And then you see inside, it looks kind of like leaves and stuff, right? White leaves. So that's a sagittal view of the cerebellum. The white material in there that looks like leaves or branches, that's called arbor vitae, or some people say arbor vitae, I believe. Let's see if they say it that way. They say vitae, vitae. Just spell it correctly, okay? You'll find they have two or three different ways to pronounce things around here. But anyway, that's the white matter within the cerebellum. Arbor means tree. Some of you know about Arbor Day. There are a few arborists in Florence, and those are the guys that know how to take down trees. They know how to trim trees so that the limbs don't fall on your roof or bang against your windows or anything like that. Now, while we're at it, looking on page 437, you're looking at the upper picture, which is really sort of a picture of the bottom, which is a real brain. I want you to look at the word that says fourth ventricle. Now, we said in the middle of the diencephalon, there was a cavity called the third ventricle. Here's the fourth ventricle. Another cavity in the brain. Somebody tells you got holes in your head, you can say, yeah, that's right, so do you. And they're full of fluid. They're full of cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. So that little cavity is called the fourth ventricle. And then you see the little tube or the little canal, or you see what they call it. They call it the cerebral aqueduct. Now, an aqueduct would be the structure like the Romans built back when everybody tried to speak Latin, or they tried to get everybody to speak Latin. That would be a conduit, a big tube, maybe open, but it'll carry water. So the cerebral aqueduct carries cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll get to a little bit later. Look over on the preceding page. And look at figure C. You'll see that up top, that's A. That shows you both of the sides of the cerebellum and the vermis in the middle. See the vermis up top? VERMIS. 436, figure A. And the first little notation on that left side says vermis. Comes from the word meaning worm. It looks like a worm. Anyway, that's in the middle, and then you have two hemispheres on the right. That picture we looked at before was cut right down the middle. This one gives you a view of the whole thing. So you got the vermis, you got the left cerebellar hemisphere and the right cerebellar hemisphere. And then you come down to figure C. You have a sagittal section. They call it a parasagittal. That's fine. And you see they've labeled some things. I want you to label or highlight, underline arbor vitae or arbor vitae, arbor vitae, vitae, I think they say in your book. Now let's go back to page 435. where you see the heading called cerebellum. Page 435, second column, the cerebellum. And look at the second sentence in the paragraph. It functions, that's the cerebellum, with the cerebral cortex and basal nuclei. You don't have to know those, we just can't cover everything. Brainstem and spinal cord in the coordination of movement. It plays a role in coordinating our movements, physical movements, whether it's walking, whether you're playing an athletic event. I keep throwing this little lady towards you, Simone Biles, who is just amazing. And her cerebellum has to really work because she's got all these twists and flips and then ends up on her feet. Every time I see her hit that mat, I think, boy, those knees and ankles are taking a beating. She's a tough little lady. I think she's close to being the #1 gymnast in the world. Fascinating little lady. But anyway, whether you're a diver, not a scuba diver so much as opposed to one who does the, say, 2.5 with 3 twists or something like that in the Olympic diving competitions. And so that cerebellum has got to work, else we don't have the coordinated movements that we think are beautiful when somebody does it. Okay, let's leave the cerebellum and let's come down to the bottom of page 435. And you see the last part on 435 is called the brainstem. Now the brainstem, we would say connects, the book's going to say connects the spinal cord to the rest of the brain. No problem with that. But the brainstem has, we're going to say, 3 components. Now, before we get into some of the functions, let's go back to page 437. And since we're looking at the brainstem, look at the top illustration, or you can look at the bottom, whatever you want to do, either one. We're going to be looking at what's called the brainstem. So come right under the overhang of the frontal lobe and look down, you see the word brainstem. And you see the brainstem is composed of 3 parts. Now that's what we say. You know, there may be stuff that we're going to find later on. There's stuff in there we don't even know what it does. But you've got the midbrain, and if you follow the line there, you can see where the midbrain is. It's got its own components that we're not going to get into. The pons, that's that bulge that you see. And then you see the medulla oblongata. Now your book's going to say, pronounce it medulla, but D-U-L-L, you go to dual parties or do you go to dull parties? Anyway, however you say it, as long as you spell it correctly, you'll be accepted. I remember, you guys remember a guy named Isaac Hayes, and he put out some kind of a song, but I remember he had this rhythm going and he was just speaking medical terms. And one of them was medulla oblongata. He's just throwing those words in there, but anyway, he's a pretty good musician. So you've got those 3 parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, that make up what we call the midbrain. Go back to page 435. Page 435. And you look under brainstem. And you come down to the third line, look over to the right. Its nuclei control many basic homeostatic functions, heart rate, and breathing rhythm. That's just a couple of them. Okay, pretty clear there. Now what we want to do is mention, we've already mentioned these homeostatic mechanisms, but I want you to look over on page 438. Page 438, come down to the bottom where you see midbrain. Here's that first section going inferiorly, the first section of the brainstem. Now, as you look in the second line of that little paragraph, 438, first column, entitled Midbrain. Come to the second line, look over to the right where you see the bold print term. The midbrain is found just inferior to the diencephalon. It surrounds a channel called the Cerebral Aqueduct. And we've talked about the third ventricle, and here's the Cerebral Aqueduct. Just let it sort of settle in your mind in a sequence. And the Cerebral Aqueduct connects the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, which we talked about underneath the cerebellum, which lies on part of the brainstem. Now, what does the midbrain do? Well, it probably does a number of things that we don't know about, but I want you to look at the bottom where you see superior and inferior colliculi. Now, don't go learn the superior and inferior colliculi. You've got enough to do, and I've got more stuff to tell you, so we're not going to worry about some specific areas. But as you look where it says superior and inferior colliculi, look at the last two sentences in that paragraph. It says these structures are involved with visual and auditory functions. Now, that's all we're going to say. Do we understand how that connects? Well, you remember those fibers we talked about, the projection fibers and so forth, the commissural fibers. There are fibers that connect, say, the hearing area and the visual area with this midbrain, and it's related to understand what we see and hear. Do we have a handle on that? No. We are still learning about that. That's all I want you to know. Auditory and acoustic, or excuse me, auditory and visual functions. Page 439. Page 439. Look down at the bottom and you see the word pons, P-O-N-S. Now you can see a picture of it up above. You see the diencephalon up there. And then you see the midbrain, and you see pons underneath it. That's in figure 1214. So what does the pons do? Well, it obviously does a number of things. We don't know it all. But look at the second column and look at the second paragraph. You see it says the Pontine Nuclei. Now remember, in the central nervous system, nuclei simply means a collection of cell bodies, as opposed to ganglia, which is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. But look what it says. Certain nuclei help regulate movements. This is in the pons, including those for breathing. Okay. Now, before we go to the third part, before we go to the medulla, I want you to go back to 437. I'm just trying to get you to implant some pictures in your mind so you can understand something I'm going to teach you a little bit later today. What time is it? 10:25? We've got about another 20 minutes. Now, we talked about a third ventricle. Talked about a fourth ventricle. Talked about a cerebral aqueduct. Okay. Look on page 437. And look to the left side of the picture. Now remember, you're looking at the right half of the brain. The left half has been removed. Now look over on the left where you see frontal lobe and come down and you see this structure that says lateral ventricle. Okay, remember how we talked about third ventricle, fourth ventricle? So this would be the right lateral ventricle, and it's deep, it's in, away from you and me. It's a cavity away from you and me in the right hemisphere, in the right cerebral hemisphere. So there's a cavity on that side. Well, it makes sense that there's a cavity on the other side, right? There's another lateral ventricle. So just try to picture this cavity going into the right cerebral hemisphere. There's a cavity over on the left. That's another lateral ventricle. So you can say left lateral ventricle, right lateral ventricle. And then they empty that fluid that we'll talk about a little bit later into the third ventricle, which is not labeled here. But what you can do is where you look over and see diencephalon, look on the right-hand side and you see diencephalon. And you see it says thalamus. Remember, there's a cavity in there. There's a space in there. That's your third ventricle. You have the third ventricle is in the middle of the thalamus. I know this is kind of hard to picture. I'm just laying down a few bricks here at this point, and hopefully it comes together with a little cement and stuff as we go on down the page. So you've got your right lateral ventricle, left lateral ventricle. You've got where your thalamus is. There's just a ventricle there. That ventricle empties into the cerebral aqueduct. It's like a little canal, which goes into the fourth ventricle. So there's this flow of fluid going through the middle of our brains. You remember those ependymal cells that we talked about that were they were non-action potential carriers, but they played a role in the health of neurons. We had Schwann cells, and we had oligodendrocytes, and we had astrocytes and all of that. So keep that in mind, okay? But here are those cavities. You got a right ventricle, left ventricle, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, you got your fourth ventricle. Now, we're not over with that yet, but we're going to try and tie it all together a little bit later. All right. Now, we're still in the brainstem. So we've covered the midbrain. You know where it is a little bit. I think you've had to learn a lot of this stuff in lab. And then the pons. Now we look at the medulla. So on page 440. And you see it says the inferior-most portion of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. Some people just call it the medulla. And you see it says, which blends with the spinal cord after it passes through the foramen magnum. Now, you remember that big hole in our head? Somebody tells you got holes in your head? That's right, you do. So do we all. Now, what I want you to know in this paragraph, it says you come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the 4 lines, and you see it says on the anterior surface, come down on the left-hand side, on the anterior surface of the medulla, we find elevated ridges known as pyramids. They really don't look like the pyramids in Egypt, that's for sure, which contain the upper motor neuron fibers of the corticospinal tract. We'll talk about those tracts in just a few minutes, maybe. And skip through the little parentheses that come from motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Within the pyramids, most fibers of the right and left corticospinal. Now, corticospinal tells you it originates in the cortex, this tract, this rail trail, so to speak, that starts in the cortex and goes down to the spine. That's a nice way to name things. Wherever what the first word is, that's where it starts. Second word, that's where it ends. Cortex, beginning. Spinal, end. Okay, down somewhere down in the spinal cord. So you see it says you got the right and left corticospinal tracts do something interesting. They cross over and switch sides, and you see the bold print term called decussate. Decussate. I got D there. Most of us used to say decussate. And then they go through the spinal cord. Okay? Why is that important to know? Those pyramids cross over. They cross over, and they're corticospinal tracts, so they carry information from the cortex down the spine. That's why the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Now, we don't know why that's done like that. All we can do is observe and say, this is what we see. So if somebody comes in, when you folks are nurses or whatever, PAs, nursing practitioners, and somebody's had a stroke and you see their right side is on the face is drooping, and you remember they don't have the right shape over here, well, that means that they got a problem on this side, on the left side. There was a stroke somewhere on the left side. And of course, knowing what is influenced by the stroke tells you what part of the brain, what part of the motor area of the frontal lobe has had that cerebrovascular incident. Don't know why. All we can do is just say that's the way it's built. Works pretty good though, doesn't it? All right. Now look over on page 441. You see this picture. Now, I don't want you to mark anything up here. I'm just trying to get you to picture the ventricles on the left-hand side. Now, you're sort of looking at the whole brain, but you're able to look through the brain and see various components. So you see lateral ventricles there, don't you? So you see how they bend, they come back. They've got all these different names for the front part and the back part and so forth. Don't worry about that. But you see how it just kind of makes a big U with a little tag sticking out in the back? Well, that would be the left lateral ventricle, and then the one that's farther away on the other side, that would be the right lateral ventricle, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Any questions so far? Well, hello, Hannah. Let's see, 10:35. Okay. Now, let's look over on page 443. And we're going to look at the coverings of the brain. Now, you already know that the brain is protected by the skull. But you also have these membranes. Some of them are pretty tough membranes. And you look on 443, 12.3, that's the section, and you come down to where you see the cranial meninges. And now some of you hear meninges and you say, oh, okay, well, that's meningitis. That's right, very serious infection. But we want to know these coverings. I don't know that you covered those in lab. I don't know that you had a model for that. But you basically have three membranes. As you look in the first column and you come down to the bottom where you see the cranial meninges, and you see it says the cranial meninges are protective membranes made of dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. Think about how strong collagen is. And the fibers are irregular. And you come down to where it says connective tissue. The outermost one is called the dura mater. I don't know what page it is in the new book. You said you had the new book, Ramsey, so I'm not sure what page it is. This was on 443. So last time you've been a couple of pages different, your book was. So just look for protection of the brain and look for cranial meninges. This should be a couple of pages from where you are. So you see it says the outermost meninx, or the outermost membrane, is the dura mater. Now, dura means tough, durable. If we talk about durable clothing, we think of it can take a lot of wear and tear. And mater, of course, they say we would think of mother, but you see what they translated as tough womb. Anyway. Come over to the second column. And you see the middle meninx is the thinner arachnoid mater. Gentle mother, no, they're not gentle mother, excuse me, that's the one that's like spider web. Isn't there a movie called Arachnophobia or something like that? Some people go bananas over spiders. Most of them don't want to bite you, but some of them do create a problem. Okay, you got the middle one, that's the thinner one, arachnoid, and then it says the thinnest and innermost is the pia mater, and that's the gentle mother. And you see it says the arachnoid and pia are separated by another narrow fluid-filled space called the subarachnoid space. Now, all you're doing is getting familiar with terminology at this point. You see the subarachnoid space contains CSF and the major blood vessels of the brain. So when somebody talks about someone's had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, not good, not good. In the second column, second column, second paragraph, you come down to the third line, you'll see subarachnoid hematomas. Hematoma, of course, is a collection of blood. Subarachnoid underneath the arachnoid membrane. Now, there are a lot of other things to look at, but I want you to look at on page 444. So don't go learn all that other stuff. I'm not going to quiz you on that. I want you to look on page 444. And I want you to look at figure C. It's actually figure 1218C. Got a frontal section again. Look at the top of that bottom image, and locate the word meningeal dura over on the right. Then you see subdural space. That's a space underneath the dura. Then you see the arachnoid. And if you look really close, the arachnoid mater, you can see all these little lines. As a matter of fact, if you move in a little bit to your left and go down, you see arachnoid trabeculae, just like in the bones, right? In the epiphysis. So you've got that layer, the arachnoid mater, and then you see subarachnoid space. And then they point to the pia mater, which is directly on the brain. And you have a lot of blood vessels there. So if you can imagine fluid filling the arachnoid space, the subarachnoid space, our brain floats in fluid. So it's a protective measure that we have. So you want to know those terms we just went over. The meningeal dura, or you can simply call it the dura mater. It's okay. We're not going to get into the periosteal dura. We're just going to get into the the dura mater, the subdural space, the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater. And you have fluid, CSF, in the subarachnoid space. So we got these spaces that are filled with fluid. Now let's look at the bottom of page 445. Right across the page, the ventricles and the cerebrospinal fluid. First column, that's the heading, the ventricles and the cerebrospinal fluid. So as you look at this picture, down at the bottom, figure 1219, and you see it's labeled the ventricles of the brain. It's that kind of blue-green color in there that they have colored in the shape of the ventricles. So let's look to the left of the left diagram and look above, and it says anterior horns of the lateral ventricles. Or you can simply just say those are the lateral ventricles. Matter of fact, that's all right. Just say they're the lateral ventricles. Remember, you got one in the right hemisphere. You have one in the left. If you look closely, you can see there's a dark line that separates those two. Don't go learn the posterior horns or anything like that. Just call it the lateral ventricles. Okay, now go to the middle where you see some writing there, and you see lateral ventricles. In the left picture, you're looking at them from a sagittal view. In the right picture, you're looking at them from a frontal view. So you see the lateral ventricles. Now come down under the lateral ventricles and you see interventricular foramen. And you see a tiny little opening, a tiny little tube. You can see it also in the right-hand picture. So there's a connection. Fluid produced in the lateral ventricles goes through that foramen into the third ventricle. Remember, the third ventricle is in the middle of the thalamus. All right, so we've got it out of the fluid flows out of the lateral ventricles, through the foramen, into the third ventricle, and look at the next structure, the cerebral aqueduct that you saw from another perspective. So fluid is flowing through that, and then you come down to the fourth ventricle. On the left-hand side, it doesn't look like it's very large, but if you look to the right, you see it's wide, but it's very shallow in terms of height. And then if you come on down from the fourth ventricle and go to the very bottom, you see the central canal of the spinal cord. Fluid flows there. Thank you. Appreciate that, Mallory. So you can imagine that flow going through all of those structures. Now, we said our brain floated in fluid. It's got fluid within, but also there's fluid without. So how does it get out? Look at your second column here on 445. I want you to look at the second component where it says fourth ventricle. Got a little dot, fourth ventricle. The third ventricle drains into the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. Now come down to where you see it says figure 1219A. And it doesn't show you very well about this, but take my word for it, it works. Please just do that. Figure 1219A, it's not in italics or anything, but it says it shows that this ventricle contains several posterior openings. That ventricle's got openings that allow CSF in the ventricles to flow into the subarachnoid space. And that is what our brain floats in. That subarachnoid space that's got CSF in it. So it's a cushion. So you seeing a circulation go in there? Now, what goes into the subarachnoid space has to come out. Look back on page 444. right across the page, look at the bottom illustration. And I want you to, as you look at the bottom illustration, go to the center of it on top. It says superior sagittal sinus and arachnoid granulation. Now, as you look at the granulation, see it looks like a little bush in that superior sagittal sinus, which acts as a blood vessel. Well, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid comes out of the subarachnoid space and goes right into the bloodstream. It came from blood, it goes back to blood. There's not blood up there because only the fluid gets out. It's like plasma. It's like plasma. So it leaves the fourth ventricle through 3 openings, gets into the subarachnoid space, and it exits the subarachnoid space through the arachnoid granulations. They used to call it arachnoid villi. Sometimes people change the name of stuff for whatever reason. And then that fluid goes back into blood. Blood would flow from through the superior sagittal sinus and eventually return to the heart. There is another picture of it that you can look at. I know we're over time, and I thank you so much for a few more minutes here. On page 446. On page 446, figure 1220. You can look at that picture, and you can look down below where you have a couple of paragraphs, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, and it will describe the flow, the origin and the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Well, what we'll get into come Tuesday will be the spinal cord, and we're going to have to rush through some stuff like that because we need to have a test next Thursday at 9:30. And we're not through with the material. I'm going to ship you material in a Word document so you can already start studying on your own. And maybe if you have questions, then hang on to it, Ramsey. Then you can ask those questions, and hopefully we'll get some clarity, and then we'll have the test on Thursday. Because we've got to go through, this is just chapter 12. See, we've got to look at the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So that's what I'm going to send to you. Okay? Got the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system within the peripheral nervous system. All right. Ramsey has a question. I can't guess what it is, Ramsey. Can you type it in? Now remember, I'm going to ship this to you. I'm going to, let me see something here. Is that it? Or is this it? I've got a page on the spinal cord, page on the peripheral nervous system with spinal nerves and cranial nerves. I've got a little bit here on 14. I should get that to you probably this afternoon. Okay, I don't understand your question. You're just making a statement there, Ramsey. Monica, you say you have a question. What chapters are going to be covered by the next? You're correct. Chapter 12, 13, 14, and 15. Now, only 15 is going to cover the eye. Okay? And what I'm going to give you in the Word document this afternoon, that's what will be on 12, 13, and 14. You're welcome. Okay, does anybody else have a question? Sure wish I was there to see you and walk amongst you and point to a picture. Hopefully we can get it all across. All right? All right, well, y'all have a good afternoon, and I'll get this to you. And don't wait till Monday to start learning this stuff. It'll blow you out of the water, unless you like getting blown out of the water. Okay? Start tonight. Okay? Or even this afternoon. Talk to the closet door. Make sure you can teach it, all right? All right, I'm going to end this, and I hope Tiffany's okay. So you guys have a good afternoon. She is doing better. They've got her on prednisone, Jerkita, and that is reducing the inflammation. We don't know why the inflammation comes about. It does in our age group, unfortunately. It was awful. It was but that prednisone has reduced it. Now, we don't want to live on prednisone, do we? That's got its own set of activities and events that sometimes create problems, like gaining weight and stuff like that. So anyway, she's much better. Thank you for that, for your concern and your prayers. All right. I'll see you folks later.